There are things old money can buy in this country that never appear on any balance sheet. Deference. Silence, the quiet cooperation of everyone in the room who has too much to lose to push back. What it cannot purchase, not in any currency, is the specific and devastating knowledge of exactly who is sitting across from you. That particular miscalculation cost Olivier Fontaine everything. On a Thursday evening in late October, inside one of the most expensive dining rooms in Vancouver, Léa Tremblay was 28 years old and had been working the floor at Maison Dorval for 14 months. She was not supposed to still be there. That was the thing nobody at the restaurant knew, the thing she carried with her through every shift like a stone in her apron pocket. 14 months ago, she had been 3 semesters away from finishing her law degree at McGill. She had been the kind of student professors mention to their next cohort as an example. She had a sharpness for contract law that her faculty advisor called, without a trace of exaggeration, genuinely rare. Then her father had his first stroke, and the world reorganized itself around that fact with brutal efficiency. Léa Tremblay had worked 31 years as a machinist in Granby. He had never missed a shift. He had never complained. He had saved what he could, spent carefully, and raised Léa to believe that a disciplined mind was the only inheritance that couldn't be taxed or taken away. The stroke left him partially paralyzed on his left side, unable to work, and cycling through a regime of medications that cost more per month than his pension covered. Léa's mother, Sylvie, had her own health to manage. There was no one else. Léa had made the decision quickly, the way she always made hard decisions, by looking at it directly and not flinching. She withdrew from McGill at the end of the fall semester, packed 2 bags, moved to Vancouver where a cousin had a spare room, and got a job. Maison Dorval was the kind of restaurant that didn't advertise. Its regulars found it through other regulars. The dining room held 42 covers and was decorated in a style that suggested old Quebec money and French provincial restraint. Exposed stone, candlelight, tablecloths the weight of good linen. The chef, a Montrealer who had trained in Lyon, had held 2 Michelin stars during a stint in London and had brought that particular standard of controlled excellence with him to the Pacific coast. The tasting menu started at $240 per person before wine. The staff at Maison Dorval was small and carefully chosen. Léa had been hired because she spoke flawless French, carried herself without apology, and had passed a service trial that weeded out 4 other candidates. The front-of-house manager, a measured man named Patrice, had told her on her first day that the guests at Maison Dorval expected invisibility married to perfection. She had understood that immediately. It was, in its way, the same discipline as law. She was good at the job. She was good at it the way she was good at most things she put her mind to, thoroughly and without fanfare. The regulars liked her. The kitchen trusted her timing. Patrice had given her the Thursday prime section 6 months into her tenure, which was the closest thing to a compliment the man offered anyone. On that particular Thursday in October, the reservation for table 7 arrived at 7:15. Olivier Fontaine was 54 years old and had been described in a recent Globe and Mail profile as one of the most influential real estate developers in Western Canada. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore his confidence the way very rich men sometimes do, not as an accessory, but as a structural component of his personality. He had made a significant portion of his fortune in condo developments along the Fraser River corridor and had recently been expanding into commercial holdings in the Okanagan. With him that evening were his wife, Constance Fontaine, a woman whose elegance was genuine, but whose warmth had long since calcified into performance, and his business partner, a man introduced to the reservation simply as Delacroix. First name Bernard, though he never offered it. They were seated by Patrice, who had personally escorted them from the entrance. Léa watched the handoff from the service station with the practiced calm she had developed over 14 months. She recognized the body language immediately. The way Fontaine took his seat without pulling it out himself, without looking at the person who had pulled it out for him. The way Delacroix scanned the dining room not with curiosity, but with the particular evaluative gaze of a man pricing everything in it. She approached the table. Bonsoir. Bienvenue à Maison d'Orval. Je m'appelle Léa et je serai votre servante ce soir. Good evening, my name is Léa, and it will be my pleasure to look after you tonight. Fontaine looked up from the menu just long enough to say, in English, water, still. And send the sommelier, not you. It was not, technically, a rude response, but there was a particular register in which those words could be said, and Fontaine had chosen that register deliberately. He had looked at her the way someone looks at a kitchen appliance, briefly to confirm it was functioning, before returning attention to more relevant matters. Léa nodded and withdrew. She returned with still water and a bread service and retreated to the shadow of the service station. Fontaine, Constance, and Delacroix had settled into conversation. They were speaking French, not the Franco-Ontarian French of government offices or the Montreal French of her childhood, but a particular French, tight, Parisian in its affectations, the kind one develops at boarding schools in Switzerland or summers spent in the Dordogne. It was the French of people who use the language not to communicate, but to create an enclosure, a private room no one else was meant to enter. Léa had grown up speaking Quebecois French at her father's kitchen table. She had refined it at McGill, where her contracts professor delivered 3-hour lectures in rapid Parisian French and expected you to keep up or fall behind. She understood every syllable of what was being said at table 7. She was almost certain they believed she did not. The service here has deteriorated, Constance said in French, barely dropping her voice. They've started hiring from the hospitality colleges. You can always tell. No instinct, just training. She's pretty enough, Fontaine said, glancing once toward the service station. But pretty doesn't pour wine correctly. Does it matter? Delacroix said. We're not here for the service. Léa poured water into Constance's glass and moved away without expression. Her pulse was even. She had heard far worse. The evening moved through its courses with the precision that defined Maison d'Orval. The amuse-bouche arrived, then the first course, a seared scallop with celery root puree and a smoked butter foam that the kitchen had been refining for 2 months. Léa served it and retreated. Each time she approached the table, the conversation in French continued without pause. They did not lower their voices. They had concluded apparently that she was furniture. The zoning approval came through on the Kelowna parcel, Fontaine said, during the second course, breaking a piece of bread without looking at it. Tremblay finally signed off. You're sure it's clean? Delacroix asked. Clean enough, Fontaine said, with the tone of a man who has decided that clean enough is a philosophical position rather than a legal one. The environmental study was conducted by Marchand's firm. Marchand owes me 2 favors and a very significant silence. The report will reflect what the report needs to reflect. Delacroix nodded slowly. And the agricultural designation. That's the elegant part. Fontaine smiled. It was a thin, well-practiced smile. The land is still technically classified as agricultural reserve. Developing it directly would require a provincial review board, which would take 3 years and generate press. But if we transfer the holding to the numbered company in Alberta, list it as a dormant holding, and then initiate the reclassification application through the Alberta office rather than BC, it bypasses the review board entirely. He paused to sip his wine. 47 acres, Bernard. At current projections, we're looking at 65 million on the residential lots alone. The provincial government will never untangle the corporate structure in time to stop it. Léa was standing 2 feet from the table, removing Constance's plate. Her hands were entirely steady. She had been trained by 14 months of this job and 3 years of law school before it to make herself invisible when invisibility was required. But she was hearing something that was not an insult. She was hearing something that was a crime. She knew enough land use law to recognize what Fontaine was describing. The transfer of a BC agricultural reserve holding through an Alberta numbered company to circumvent a provincial review board was not a grey area. It was not aggressive but technically legal tax planning. It was deliberate regulatory fraud, and if the environmental assessment had been manipulated to conceal contamination data, the exposure went well beyond provincial jurisdiction. She knew that with the same certainty she had known the answer to exam questions she had studied for in the law library at McGill, until the cleaning staff asked her to leave. She cleared the plate and walked back to the kitchen. The third course came and went. Fontaine ordered a second bottle, a burgundy that cost $420, and handed it to Léa to open as though handing a parking ticket to an attendant. Then the conversation shifted. "The Waitress situation is going to cost us," Delacroix said in French, setting down his fork. "The one at the Penticton site. She filed a complaint with the Labour Board." "Which one?" Fontaine said. "The young one. The one we let go in August. She's claiming constructive dismissal." Fontaine made a sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh. "Her name? Audette. 31. Single mother. Her counsel is some legal aid solicitor." "Legal aid." Fontaine repeated the words the way one might say bad weather, an inconvenience, a delay. "Tell Marchetti to make her a quiet offer. Something that requires a full non-disclosure. Make sure she understands, and I do mean understands clearly, that a drawn-out hearing will be considerably more unpleasant for a single mother working minimum wage than it will be for us." Delacroix nodded once, satisfied. Constance sipped her wine and said nothing. Léa was standing at the service station. She had heard everything. Her jaw was set. She was not going to cry. She was not going to put the wine bottle down too hard or let any of what she was feeling surface through her expression. She had not come this far, had not held herself together through 14 months of smiling at men like Fontaine, while she sent money home to Granby and studied employment law on her days off, to break now, in a dining room, in front of people who would not register it as anything but an inconvenience. But she was also done, not done in the impulsive way, done in the way she recognized from law school, the clarity that settled over her in a moot court when she had identified precisely which argument was going to win, cold and sharp and absolutely certain. The fourth course was a duck confit with a wild blueberry reduction and a fennel gratin. Léa brought it to the table herself, settling each plate with the precision Patrice had trained her. As she set Fontaine's plate in front of him, she noticed that he had knocked his knife to the floor, without acknowledging it. He held up 2 fingers without looking at her. She retrieved a clean knife from the service station and returned. As she placed it beside his plate, Fontaine said to Delacroix, still in French, still at full conversational volume, still in absolute confidence that he was inside a room no one else could enter. The difficulty with restaurants like this is they cannot find anyone capable anymore. Look at the hands. You can always tell. Service people have hands that give them away entirely. Constance smiled faintly into her wineglass. Léa straightened up from the table. She looked at Olivier Fontaine for a long, specific moment, not the professional non-look she had been deploying all evening, an actual look. the kind she used to give opposing counsel in moot scenarios when they had made a critical error and did not yet know it. She spoke in French, not the Parisian French they had been using, the French of Granby, of her father's kitchen, of every summer her grandfather had taken her fishing on the San Francois River and told her that a person of substance bows to no one. "Your knife, Monsieur Fontaine," she said in French, her voice carrying the calm, unmistakable authority of someone who has decided the time for invisibility is over. "And while I have your attention, the Kelowna agricultural parcel, the transfer to the Alberta Numbered Company, the environmental report from Marchaud's firm." She let each sentence land separately. "I have been refilling your wine for 4 courses. In this province, deliberate misrepresentation to circumvent an agricultural land reserve review constitutes regulatory fraud under the Agricultural Land Commission Act. If the environmental data was altered, that exposure is federal." The table went silent in the way that expensive restaurants are not supposed to go silent. Fontaine's fork stopped moving. He turned to look at her fully for the first time all evening. What she saw in his face was not anger yet. It was the specific, visceral shock of a man who has just discovered that the room he believed was private had a window. "Pardon," he said, in French, barely audible. Léa continued, still in French, still at conversational volume, because the tables adjacent to them were close enough that this, too, was a choice she was making deliberately. "My name is Léa Tremblay. My father is Gerard Tremblay, a machinist from Granby who worked 31 years without missing a shift. I was enrolled in the law program at McGill until his stroke required me to withdraw. What I did not leave at McGill is 3 years of contract law, land use regulation, and administrative procedure. To tight, everything discussed to recall, date, and corroborate with the names of the individuals present. Delacroix had gone the color of old ash. He stood in distance from Fontaine by inches, as though creating Zivinstwentint might constitute a legal defense. Constance had set down her wine glass. She was looking at her husband with an expression that was not quite horror and not quite surprise. Something in between, the face of a woman who has suspected certain things for a very long time and has just been handed the evidence. Fontaine found his voice. It was not the voice he had been using all evening. It was smaller. "You don't understand what you heard." "I understand exactly what I heard," Léa said gently, as though correcting a student who had made a common error. "I want to be clear that I am not threatening you. I am informing you, as someone with relevant training, that what was discussed at this table tonight does not stay in this room simply because you conducted the conversation in a language you assumed no one here spoke." She folded her hands in front of her apron. "The woman in Penticton, Audette, you said, single mother, legal aid counsel. I am also informing you that coercing a Labour Board complainant into a non-disclosure through financial pressure and implicit intimidation constitutes obstruction. That is not my opinion. That is Section 435.1 of the Criminal Code." Fontaine opened his mouth, closed it. At the adjacent table, a couple in their 60s had ceased any pretense of their own conversation. The man's hand rested on the stem of his wineglass, motionless. Delacroix stood. "We're leaving," he said to Fontaine, in English now, as though switching languages might restore some control over the situation. Fontaine did not move immediately. He was staring at Léa with the bewildered look of a man attempting to locate the moment he had lost. She held his gaze without difficulty. She had held more uncomfortable gazes in moot court, in the hallways of hospital administrative offices, in the social assistance offices where she had helped her mother navigate benefit applications on her days off. "The duck is very good," Léa said in English, finally. "It would be a shame to leave it." Then quietly, almost to herself, back in French. Mon grand-père m'a appris que la dignité ne se loue pas. On la porte avec soi ou on ne l'a pas du tout. My grandfather taught me that dignity is not rented. You either bring it with you or you don't have it at all. She turned and walked back toward the service station. Constance Fontaine did not follow her husband when he finally stood. She remained seated for a long moment, her hands flat on the white linen, her eyes on the candle in front of her. Then she picked up her bag, pulled out her phone, and made a call before she had even reached the door. Those at the adjacent tables could not hear what she said, but she did not sound like a woman calling a car. She sounded like a woman calling a lawyer. Patrice found Léa in the service corridor 2 minutes later. He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, which was unusual for Patrice, who was a man of precise and readable expressions. "Table 7, he said. "Yes," Léa said. "You spoke to Fontaine." "I did." Patrice was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I heard most of it," he said. "The Beaulieu-Ramsays at the adjacent table heard most of it too. Henry Beaulieu-Ramsay is a retired Superior Court judge." Léa said nothing. Patrice exhaled. "Take the rest of the evening. I'll cover your section." He paused. "Léa, what you said in there, were you certain of it?" "Yes," she said. "I was certain." He nodded slowly. "Then go home. We'll speak tomorrow." She untied her apron, folded it over the edge of the service counter, and walked out through the kitchen, past the line cooks, who had no idea what had just happened, through the back door, and into the October air of a Vancouver alley that smelled like rain and cold pavement, and the particular freedom of having said exactly what needed to be said to exactly the person who needed to hear it. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph was for people who had expected a fight. Léa had simply done what her father had raised her to do, looked at the thing clearly, without flinching, and said what was true. She called her mother from the bus home. "Ça va, ma belle?" her mother asked. "How are you?" "Ça va," Léa said. "Tell Papa I said good night." What followed the evening at Maison Dorval unfolded the way these things unfold when the right information reaches the right people through the right channels, slowly, and then all at once. Henry Beaulieu-Ramsay, the retired Superior Court judge, had indeed heard the conversation at Table 7. He was, by temperament and decades of professional habit, a man who wrote things down. He had, on the evening in question, made notes on the back of the restaurant's menu card. He passed those notes, along with a brief summary, to a former colleague still sitting on the BC Supreme Court bench, who passed them to the Agricultural Land Commission's legal office. The Commission had been aware of irregularities in the Kelowna parcel file for some time, but had lacked the specific thread that would allow them to pull the corporate structure apart. The description of the Alberta transfer mechanism, delivered in specific detail by Olivier Fontaine himself, in a dining room, to a woman he had assessed as irrelevant, was that thread. The environmental firm, it was Marchand, as Léa had noted, not Marchetti. Fontaine had confused his own collaborators in the heat of conversation, was audited within 6 weeks. The original soil contamination data from the Kelowna site, data that had been significantly softened in the final published report, was recovered from an analyst's backup files. The discrepancy was unambiguous. Bernard Delacroix cooperated with investigators before Fontaine had retained full legal counsel. The speed of that cooperation was notable and did not, in the end, significantly improve Delacroix's position. Fontaine was charged under the Agricultural Land Commission Act and faced additional federal exposure related to the corporate transfer structure and the suppressed environmental data. His bail conditions were set on a Tuesday morning. His photograph, slightly unflattering, ran in the Vancouver Sun that afternoon. The woman in Penticton, her name was Joelle Audette. She was 31 years old, and she had 2 children, not one. A detail Delacroix had evidently not thought worth mentioning was contacted by a senior employment law firm in Vancouver that had read out the Fontaine case and recognized the name of the numbered company. The firm took her case on a contingency basis. The constructive dismissal claim was settled out of court for an amount that allowed Joelle Audette to move her family into a better apartment and retain a portion in savings which she had not had before. Léa learned about Joelle through a reporter who called her 6 weeks after the dinner, asking for comment on a story about the Fontaine case. She declined to comment. She asked the reporter before hanging up whether Joelle had a good outcome. The reporter, slightly surprised to be asked, said yes. Léa thanked him and returned to what she had been doing, which was studying. Patrice had not asked her to leave Maison Dorval. He had, in fact, given her a different section, the private dining room on the upper floor, which was quieter and better tipped, and had said nothing further about the evening except, once, to observe that she had a quality he could not quite name, but that he found useful in a dining room. What Léa had and what she was working to get back was the particular clarity of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and exactly why. She reapplied to McGill's law program in November with a letter of explanation, her original transcripts, and a reference from a retired superior court judge who had, it turned out, been impressed enough by what he heard at a restaurant table in October to put his name on a document. The letter of admission came in March. She gave Patrice 3 weeks' notice and worked every one of those shifts with the same precision she had brought to the first day. On her last evening, the kitchen sent out an extra amuse-bouche to the staff after service. The sous-chef, a quiet Haitian-Canadian named Theodore, who had never said more than 12 words to her in 14 months, put a small folded paper on top of hers. She opened it. It said, in his small, careful handwriting, "Bonne chance, maître." Good luck, counselor. She had not told any of them she was going back to law school. She thought about that for a long time on the drive home, about the things people see in us before we say them aloud, about the language that exists underneath the language we choose to speak, the one that carries what we actually are, the one that can't be faked by money or pedigree, or $400 worth of Burgundy. Her father still did, even now, with his left side that didn't cooperate and his mornings that took longer than they used to. She was her father's daughter. She had always known that. She was just, finally, on her way back to being the rest of herself too.